Well, welcome! If you've seen our other video where we make a recipe for whole wheat bread called Just Bread, you've seen this mess get created. And since we've already made the mess, we figured we might as well make a batch of biscuits while we're at it, because it's going to make a mess on the table as well. So that's what we're going to do. You're about to watch some guy from New Hampshire make a recipe called Southern Biscuits. It's a great recipe that I got from Alton from the TV show Good Eats. It's never done me wrong, but I have made a couple of changes to the recipe to kind of suit my tastes. I take a very lazy approach, and I'm going to use my food processor to get most of the hard work done. So the first step is I'm going to use a cup of white whole wheat flour. I try to sneak this flour into basically everything I make, not just breads and things like that, but I use it for cookies, I use it for biscuits, I use it all over the place. So I'm not gonna use the scale for this. I'm just gonna loosen up the flour a little bit. Add a cup of flour to the bowl for my food processor. And now I like to add the other ingredients on top of this before I put the final cup of flour on top of this. So I'm all set with the white whole wheat. I'm gonna give this a good squeeze of honey. I don't measure this, I just kind of go in a ring. And when I've closed the ring, I've used enough honey. And the recipe calls for a couple of leavening agents, and you do want to be a little bit careful with those. So the first thing it calls for is 4 teaspoons of baking powder. And if you didn't know this already, I'll let you know now. 1 tablespoon is 3 teaspoons. So I need to put in 4 teaspoons. So I'm going to do 1 tablespoon and 1 teaspoon. Which will get me to the 4 teaspoon measure. And then it needs 1/4 teaspoon of baking soda. Just a little tiny bit. Now the recipe calls for 4 tablespoons of fat overall. Alton Brown calls for 2 tablespoons of butter and 2 tablespoons of shortening. I find I like them better with just butter. So that's what I'm going to use today. I find this recipe works best if I cut the butter into small cubes before I incorporate it. So I've now cut the butter into little sticks, and I'm going to push it over and cut it into little cubes. And then I just take those cubes and I put them on this open layer. For the second cup of flour, I'm going to use 1 cup of all-purpose flour. We don't really use a lot of all-purpose flour for most of our baking. It's usually bread flour and white whole wheat flour. We have it around, I think, just for biscuits, basically. Then the last ingredient you want to make sure you add is a little bit of salt. The recipe calls for about 3/4 teaspoon. And I know Alton Brown is a kosher salt guy, so I don't have to worry about the weights and how much saltier my salt might be versus his salt. It's nice and easy. I'm going to pulse this on my little food processor here, and you'll see it will kind of rise up the sides as we go. And it's pretty simple to tell when it's done. As you're pulsing or running your food processor, you can feel it hitting the chunks of butter, and eventually that stops. And when that stops, it's ready. I'm going to dump all this into one bowl, and I'm going to put 1 cup of buttermilk into that bowl. I don't mind getting my hands dirty, but I prefer to get this started with something. And once it starts to come together, you can get it out onto the table. This is where things can get a little bit messy. Without adding too much extra flour, you're going to want to work it into a bit of a dough. Might need a little bit more flour if you don't mind opening one of those, my dear. And I'm going to try to press it flat, and then I'm going to kind of fold it into thirds. This kind of helps build layers, which I like in my final biscuit. You don't want to work it too much because it will get tough. So I don't do too much with it, I just kind of press it. And then I'm going to do that one more time. Just like that. Pretty simple. Just going to press it out now to the thickness I am looking for.
And that looks pretty good. I don't worry if it's a little bit messy looking. And then I use a biscuit cutter. We make biscuits often enough that we've invested the 90 cents or so to get them. And I just cut out my biscuits, and I place them on a tray. We're going to do these in the toaster oven. So Alton's recipe says to crank your oven up to 450, but I find I have to turn the temperatures down a little bit in the toaster oven. So my toaster oven is set at 425. And then you kind of make one ugly biscuit at the end. I'm sure there are people who are better at this than I, but I always end up with kind of an little ugly biscuit at the end. So these are essentially done. I like them to be touching. I think that they rise better. And then before I cook them, I just press my thumb in, like a little indentation. Just helps them not be too round on top when they finish baking. Just a little thumbprint like that. And these are going to go into the toaster oven for 12 minutes.